Morning, everybody. It's great to have you joining us here today. My name is Lee Weintraub. I'm a partner at Becker and Polikoff, and I welcome you to my new law office. I have designed it to look like a kitchen, so it feels nice and comfortable. We've got a great panel that we've assembled here today for an interesting webinar, because what we're going to do over the next hour isn't so much answer questions, because like you, everybody's got questions, not a whole lot of answers yet. What's going on right now with the virus has impacted construction projects all over the world in various and sundry ways, but we don't have answers because we don't yet have court decisions. We don't yet have legislative action. We don't yet have finality with how insurance companies are going to handle claims. And so we're not going to purport to give any of that to you. Instead, what we're going to do with our panelists is identify issues. What's going on in construction? How are things changing? How might it impact the quality of the work, warranty issues, the timing of construction? What are insurance companies doing? Just to kind of benchmark about what's happening out there in the field, identify some issues you may not have thought of, and make some suggestions about how you might be able to ameliorate some of the impacts that we have. And so that's what we're going to be doing. And in order to do that, we assembled this panel. And so we're going to do some quick introductions, and then we're going to dive right in. And so my name again is Lee Weintraub. I'm a partner at Becker and Polikoff. I'm the vice chair of the firm's construction law and litigation group and the chair of its public-private partnership group. And I'm a board certified construction attorney. And so next up, we have Doug Hutchinson. Doug, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, Lee. Doug Hutchinson with Meisner Electric. I'm the chairman and chief executive officer. We're based in Delray Beach. We have offices in Sarasota as well as Miami. And good morning, everyone.
Okay, next is Janice Oliva.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Janice Oliva. I work with Hollywood Woodwork. We are a specialty subcontractor. We are kind of unique because we do both the manufacturing process as well as the job site installation. So I'm looking forward to speaking with everybody on the impacts to our business.
And finally, last but not least, we have Bill Parker.
Thanks, Lee. I'm Bill Parker. I'm with InSource, which is part of Acrisure. We have 300 plus offices across the United States, and we focus, our number one industry is construction. So I'm a senior risk advisor with InSource and a shareholder with Acrisure.
Great. Well, thanks, guys, and thank you very much for joining us on this presentation. And so what we're going to cover is a lot of miscellany dealing with construction projects. We'll talk about some legal issues that we're actually going to start off with. We're going to talk about job progress and how it's being impacted, what's happening with the building departments and whether they're inspecting and not, and how that impacts quality of work and progress schedules. We'll talk about insurance and bonding issues. We have a lot of people signed up for this, and there is a broad breadth of industry groups that you all represent. I see a lot of owners, developers, contractors, subs, and other affiliates who work within the industry. So we're going to try to keep things as broad as we can so there's some information for everybody. But if we miss anything and something's on your mind, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and feel free to just type us a question. And I'm watching the questions as they come up, and based on how many we're getting, we're going to stop the discussion a little bit early and start going into a Q&A. So we're going to get started with a topic that we really see quite a bit, and that is the force majeure. In my world, there are webinars and conferences and questions all over the place about the force majeure clause, because a lot of people are invoking that. As you all probably have seen by now, construction is moving in Florida. It's permitted as an essential industry. There are some owners, Disney included, that has chosen to stop construction, but for the most part, they're working. But then the question becomes about the project delays. We've got laborers who aren't showing up because they're afraid of catching the virus or infecting their families. We've got supply chain issues. It's hard to get the materials. And so all that carries contractual liability. And so contractors and owners are considering whether to invoke force majeure clauses. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically a clause that says if things become impossible to perform under your contract because of unanticipated circumstances that are just beyond anybody's control, then you have an opportunity to terminate the contract. And so a question that we're asked probably more than any other question since this started is this force majeure? And in true lawyer fashion, the answer is it depends. It depends on what your contract says. You really need to look at it. Every force majeure clause is written completely different than the others. And they specify what constitutes a force majeure, what doesn't constitute a force majeure, what your rights are or are not under a force majeure. You need to read it very carefully. But to go a step further, reading it sometimes isn't enough. Because when we're dealing with this pandemic, there's an unresolved legal issue that the courts are eventually going to address, no doubt. And that is what really caused the work to stop. Was it a natural phenomenon, the virus, or was it governmental action with the executive order shutting things down? And so who really knows exactly how those two circumstances are going to impact what we're dealing with, but that's where the lawyers are going to be fighting. And so you need to read your clauses carefully, see if it covers things like natural causes and pandemics, see if it causes governmental action or covers governmental action, and then based on that, make decisions about your force majeure implementation. A lot of you are probably using AIA contracts. I'm sure most of you know that that's the closest thing we have to a standard set of construction contracts in the United States. They're promulgated by the Association or the American Association of Architects. And so for those of you who work with AIA, there is no force majeure clause per se in those contracts. There is a force majeure-ish provision that is buried in there that operates similar to how a force majeure would operate, but it's not called out as such separately. One thing that is in those contracts, though, that you need to watch out for that could be concerning is the unmodified version of those contracts give the contractor the right to terminate the contract if work is stopped for 30 consecutive days. And so we're already there, and I've already heard from a lot of contractors that they're invoking that. So from the owner's standpoint, it's something you need to address. If it hasn't happened yet, that termination, you need to get at the front end of that and start dealing with your contractor to ensure it won't happen because they have the right to do that. From a contractor standpoint, if you're thinking about invoking that, a couple things you need to think about. First of all is any loan documents, line of credit you might have that covers this project may have conditions in the documents establishing conditions of termination, and you can't violate those merely because your contract gives you the right to terminate. Another thing is if it's a bonded job, you should consult with your surety, because as soon as you terminate, the surety is kind of hanging out there. And so what happens then about claims that may come up for either performance or payment? What happens with the surety's right to collect money from the owner when they have to pay out claims? All that becomes in a state of flux because you just terminated the contract in the middle. So there's a lot to think about with the force majeure and how to handle it. Again, like I told you, we're going to give you more suggestions and ideas than answers. The ultimate answer here is get at the front end of it. Think about it, plan for it, figure out the best way to handle it. If you're concerned that your contracting partner may invoke it, then get at the front end and have that conversation and try to prevent it if that's what your goal was. And so that's my legal opening. And so we're going to turn it over now to our other experts. I mentioned a couple minutes ago that one of the big concerns right now is what the building departments are doing, because they're not all open and they're not all doing inspections the way they should, which impacts progress of work and impacts quality of work. And so, Doug, let me turn it over to you. What are you seeing in that regard, and what kind of suggestions can you offer about how to ameliorate some of that effect?
Well, first of all, we work on a lot of long-term contracts. So the impact immediately with the building departments has not been felt for those that are closed. With regards to those that remain open, there's a long line generally when you file for a permit, but it's gotten a little bit longer. And I believe that what we're going to see is the economy starts back up again and new permits begin to get issued. They'll be issued at a slower pace. There'll be longer lines, and it's going to be tough to get inspections out there. So a lot of patience is going to be required by the construction community in general. We have noticed a difference with the social distancing and the protocols that have been placed on our jobs. Certainly with our labor force, we've issued I guess what they call the safe passage letters, which are the orders showing that we're essential to the workforce. And we've been able to navigate pretty well so far, but we definitely expect backlogs and backups in the authorities having jurisdiction once they get open again.
Janice, what are you saying in terms of changes on the job site?
Thank you, Lee. What we're seeing right now on the job site is the general contractors are making sure that us as a subcontractor, we are keeping our employees safe, having PPE equipment available. They do understand that supplies on this is limited, like for N95 masks, but they are asking that we do show up with masks. We are seeing job sites really trying to enforce the CDC guidelines, keeping workers at a safe distance as much as possible, so that we don't have any job sites being closed.
How are these changes that you guys are experiencing impacting job progress and work quality for Doug and Janice together?
Janice, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. So right now, I would say on a quality standpoint, we have to be proactive in knowing and communicating with the general contractor on any potential schedule delays. That is been sort of the new norm at this point, is that constant communication. We aren't seeing projects slow down. It depends on the project itself. We are seeing schedules change, but overall quality, we're still expected to perform at the same level.
And Doug, before we run over to you for your input, let me follow up on the schedules. So as the schedules are changing, are they being sent to you as updates in the context of acceleration and recovery schedules, or are they reflecting slower progress? And if they're reflecting slower progress, are they being sent to you like as a prerequisite to a claim, or does it seem like everyone's acknowledging that things are just going to be slow and no one's to blame?
Well, I think we're all in this together. Most of our general contractor customers, as well as the owners, understand that a certain amount of patience is to be employed here. We're seeing that for the most part, we're getting, when we step on a job site in the morning, we go through certain protocols. A lot of job sites, a lot of our GC customers, and even where we've been able to find them, the thermal scan thermometers that they point at your head. We're getting our temperature taken each morning. We even have that protocol issued here at our office. Most of my employees are working from home. We have, I think, about the owners as well as a few of the senior managers are reporting to the office and some essential clerical personnel, but we only have 8 people out of normally the 65 we have here at the office. We only have 8 working. And those protocols are implemented the same on the job site. Masks, of course, are being employed, especially in Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County on those job sites. We haven't noticed this same strictness on some of our Florida West Coast operations, but the foremen are all coming back, and the field managers are all coming back with the same thing, that it's uncomfortable, it's inconvenient, but they're doing it because we want to work safely, and that's our primary goal here. With regards to our customers, like I said, going back to the schedule thing, Lee, it's been, we're all working together on this. There has been a spirit of cooperation. It's not quite as adversarial, and I hate to use that word because most of our jobs aren't adversarial, but sometimes there's a little push, in the project meeting, and they're giving you look aheads, and they're saying, look, we need you to perform, or we need you to do by this. we do suspect that once things begin to return to normal, we'll see a return to that. And obviously,
and all will be right with the world.
We're going to have to be on top of it. We expect some compression on some of the more tighter jobs we're working on, especially those jobs where we're performing healthcare and they've got target dates to open. We expect that to be of concern, but as we normally do, we would submit for any of those impacts and work in a cooperative manner with our customer, not like I said, that adversarial. I hate that word, but sometimes it does become that way. But for the most part, we try to look for the win-win situation.
And so the summary to what you're saying, if I got you right, Doug, and correct me, is to put a ribbon on the scheduling discussion. Is right now there's a whole lot of camaraderie and kumbaya because everyone understands. But reading of the tea leaves for you is once we are all paroled from this sentence, there will be some recovery claims and acceleration claims that will carry with it money. And I guess that will be where the other shoe drops.
Yeah, and when you say claims, I think there's going to be people will submit for impacts. And one of the things we've done lately, especially on new contracts we're signing, we're putting in a clause that's, a lot of our contracts, they want us to accept them without labor or material escalations, but we're in a brand new world and my crystal ball's broken. And I think we're starting to look at this thing and say, if there are impacts directly related to COVID-19, we're going to have to all sit down and talk about them. And we're putting that into our contracts right now. We're not accepting language where they're saying no labor impact and no material escalations.
Yeah, and that's a great takeaway too for everyone who's watching is this is going to change how things are done going forward, and lawyers are already redrafting upcoming and future construction contracts to start taking these kinds of things into consideration. So you'll see some new commonly used clauses that are going to come out of this. So that's scheduling. Let's turn our attention to quality of work now. And so when we assembled this panel, we deliberately chose Meisner and Hollywood Woodwork because they are exemplary subcontractors and suppliers that do really good work, and we felt that they are great ambassadors for their respective industry. And so I don't suggest for a second that either of you are quality of issues candidates, but construction is full of them. And so based on what is going out on the projects, to both Doug and Janice, building departments, like we said, are not regularly inspecting, crews are understaffed, people are uncertain about how things are going, supply chain has been tied up and slowed down, and this, I would assume, is going to start to materialize in the form of defects or problems with the work. What are you guys seeing or hearing among your peers that's going on in terms of work quality, and what suggestions do you have about that? Doug or Janice? You're muted, Doug. Doug, hit unmute.
I'm waiting for Janice. I've been doing a lot of talking here, so I want to hear what she has to say.
All right, Janice.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Right now on the quality side of things is basically putting our people first and making sure that they know that when they show up to a job site, their safety and their health right now is a top priority, which I think it will transfer to the fact that they're still focused on the job at hand. Trying to minimize the fear aspect of it on the job site is another top priority right now. We want to create an environment that allows the employee to be focused on their passion, which is the work that they're producing, whether that's in our manufacturing facility or that's on the job site itself. These are all small things that can be done to help the employees feel a sense of normalcy. And I think right now with this pandemic, that is very critical to any business, regardless if you're in construction. We need to know that this is temporary. It's not going to be forever. We will see some new norms, but out of it, we'll be better. We'll be healthier, for one, and our mindset will be more focused on what our priorities are, and that's, you know, the performance and the quality of our true passion, and that's our work at this point.
Well,
Doug, yeah, go
I
ahead.
would like to run at it a little differently from a quality perspective. We're still enforcing the same levels. Certainly, what we do is dangerous, and we have to still enforce all of our safety protocols. And now with the COVID-19 protocols, as Janice mentioned, you have a different layer on there that's with the masks and the protection, the protective gear. We enforce that as a rule in general. One of the things that I think may be a result or an unintended consequence of the COVID-19 is that, as you were pointing out, Lee, that they may not inspect as closely because they're taxed, their resources are taxed. Some things may get by the inspector, which later on will create warranty issues. And by the way, for jobs that have ceased where we've already installed equipment, we've got potential warranty issues there as well, because if you have a generator that you've installed and maybe you haven't tested it yet, but the clock already started ticking as far as the manufacturer is concerned. And when you get down the road, if the job's been delayed because of the pandemic, or you've got other circumstances that are involved, delays because the owner pulled people off the job site, or perhaps even the GC, then you better be looking at your warranty, and you better be talking to your equipment manufacturers, and in some cases be very careful down the road. So with the inspections maybe not being as tight as they could be, with maybe work crews being a little more hurried than they normally would, you have potential warranty issues that are going to crop up down the road. And maybe Bill wants to comment from a surety or an SDI perspective, but it's going to be, I think there's going to be some issues.
Bill, you have anything you want to add?
Well, I mean, certainly there's the potential there. The good news for us is that work largely continues here. But to the extent that you feel like you may have an issue either with your own company or with your subcontractors in the event of SDI or subcontractor bonding, certainly bring your insurance broker into that conversation immediately, and bring your surety or your subcontractor default insurance provider, bring them into that conversation as well, because part of what's going to come out of this is communication is key.
And so to put a legal overlay on all of this, we're talking about claims. We're talking about scheduling claims. We're talking about quality of work. Doug brings up an excellent point on warranty, and all these are claims. And so from an owner's perspective, you need to be looking, and even from a contractor's perspective on delay, you need to be looking at your contract, because most construction contracts, as you know, have mandatory written notice requirements that have to be done timely and properly in order to perfect these claims. And so most of these contracts say that you have to serve a written notice on your contracting partner within X number of days of the circumstance that gives rise to the claim being determined, that you first realized that happened. And so that happened a long time ago with this virus. That happened last month. And so your clock may already be ticking on doing written notices of claims. And if you don't timely serve them and you don't properly serve them as your contract calls for, you may lose all entitlement, even if you otherwise would be in the right. So pull out your contracts if you haven't already done it. Owners, contractors, subs, figure out what your increased price or increased time might be and get those notices out. So Bill, you have been monopolizing this conversation so far, but we're going to give you another shot. Why don't we talk a little bit about what the insurance climate looks like now in the wake of this pandemic?
Sure. I think, as I said a minute ago, the good news is largely in South Florida, construction continues. But the bad news is that even though revenue on ongoing work is not necessarily heavily impacted yet, per se, there may well be increased expenses associated with COVID-19. And the question that I'm fielding most frequently is, where can I try to find some help with those expenses? And the most obvious place to look would be the property policy that has business income and extra expense coverage as part of its overall contract. But unfortunately, either by definition or coverage trigger or outright exclusion, the vast majority of property policies weren't intended to cover something like COVID-19. And so you'll find that the initial response is going to probably be negative. That said, there's a lot of legal activity around this coverage. You've probably read it, seen it, including coverage determination lawsuits. There are actually people in certain industries that will add this coverage at a considerable expense, but they're very large, usually global, sometimes national, very large national providers. Some of these folks even had their policies endorsed to include a pandemic coverage, but it's a named perils basis, and they're getting denied coverage on their claim because the words aren't specific to COVID-19. So there's a lot of legal activity going on here that will have a trickle-down effect potentially to everyone that has these policies. States are looking at legislation. I don't think that most states, if any of them, will go forward with that for constitutional reasons. There's also conversations at the legislative and executive branches of federal government. So stay tuned, but just know that the intent is that your property policy does not typically include coverage for a virus or a pandemic like COVID-19.
And so would your advice, Bill, be for someone with a claim to just refrain from making the claim because of what you just said, or should they still try to pursue it?
Yeah, excellent question. And my advice would be, if you think you have a claim, pursue it. Go ahead and submit it. You need to have, obviously, very strong tracking of all your additional costs that are associated with dealing with COVID-19. Even though the policy's intention may not be to cover it, we don't know precisely how some of this case law is going to come down. We don't know the level of forgiveness that might be provided by some of the insurers. And every policy is different, although there are some things that are fairly common across policy language. Every policy ultimately reads different. And as a result, it's better to go ahead and submit a claim if you feel like you have had extra expenses associated with this. I will say also that on the business income side of the world in construction, that's a tough area to prove because you're involved in ongoing contracts, and typically they're looking at year-over-year revenues. And because contracts are finite in term and not guaranteed on a go-forward basis, the business income side of the claim is going to be more difficult to prove. But certainly a lot of folks are taking on additional expenses as they create safe job sites for their employees and their subcontractors and folks to work on.
All right, so let's develop this a little bit. And Doug and Janice, I'm going to ask you to chime in as well. This is not a rehearsed question, but I'm going to follow up on what Bill just said here. And so number one, he's saying that the business interruption claims are hard to prove. And then number two, when he was talking in the context of the property insurance claims, you mentioned very quickly about tracking COVID-related costs separately. And so this is a point that I think really warrants a little bit of attention, because it's one thing to make the claim and to follow the requirements legally in terms of processing your insurance policies to get the claim in place, but then they're going to say how much. And now you need to be able to come up with your dollars. And so for all three of you, what advice do you have for our participants here about how to track the claims that are COVID related? What types of claims are we talking about? Do you suggest a separate accounting system be maintained, a different, file number, or what do you do to segregate them that will make it more palatable for an insurance company?
So I do strongly recommend setting up a separate accounting tracking that can be through at a job level as well as your general like your GL accounts. You need to isolate everything, and that's true for what Bill is mentioning right now, to track your expense and your costs. You have to think as if you're going to be audited on that. Even if you go ahead and you process the claim, make sure you have all the supporting documentation for that to represent where that cost came from, because I do think that even if you file that claim, it will be scrutinized. So think in the terms of what would an auditor be looking for.
Excellent point. Doug, Bill, anything to add?
Well, two things. If you're going to file a claim, you need to prove you were impacted, number one, and then two, the question is usually how much or to what extent. I think with some of the programs that the government has put in place, that's going to be the first line of defense rather than to actually go file a claim. Like if you've had people that have been impacted, or you through the CARES Act can get some level of reimbursement, you can prove your business has been impacted, well then seek out what you can get from those programs first. And then secondly, to the extent where I think the impact is going to come, at least for our business, is maybe in that schedule compression eventually, or stacking of trades potentially could occur, or the acceleration at the end of the job because the productivity hasn't been exactly what it should have been, and then it all gets compressed at the end of the job. So those are going to be the kinds of things, and I think a good partnership with your business partners, meaning communicate. I think Janice brought it up earlier. Communication is key with your owner, with your general contractor, and the other subs on the job, the other trade contractors that are out there.
All right, and so Doug, you just described, well, you and Janice both just described circumstances, the types of claims that will come out of this. Now, specific dollar amounts, what types of costs are we talking about that need to be segregated? Is it labor, increased labor? How do you determine the increase to segregate? What are the specific costs you're going to track separately the way that Janice described?
Well, certainly one of the things we look at is manpower. And if we had to put additional manpower on a job, and the loading of the manpower is different than what was originally projected with the schedule. You start with the schedule. If you're getting regular updates to the schedule and the owner's getting regular updates to the schedule, then you don't necessarily have to separate accounting. You can say, look, we added 6 bodies over here, and those bodies cost X per day, and you don't have to necessarily break it out. Now, if you could break it out, you're obviously going to have a stronger present a stronger case. But it's tough to do that when everything's flying around, and it's tough to get your field manager, okay, put it in the bucket over here versus the bucket over here. That's always been the catch-22 for us.
But to Janice's point, you got to survive the audit. So it's got to be done in a way that's going to sell the insurance company.
Correct.
All right. So Bill, let's go back to you. Business interruption. You said it's a hard type of claim to prove. And so for the owners who are attending this webinar, what types of damages do you think would have the most chance of making it through a business interruption claim, assuming you get past the coverage question?
I think if it was, the business interruption is comprised of 2 different components, and extra expense is the second side of the coverage component. And I think that extra expense is, if there's coverage to be found, the most likely place to find it. And, you know, just to kind of piggyback on Janice and Doug's comments, I think in a perfect world, and it's not always attainable, but in a perfect world, you would be able to isolate those extra expenses on your financial reconciliations for the job. And in addition to isolating the expenses, you would also want to have very copious notes on why those additional expenses came up. You can't just simply say it was COVID-19. There has to be circumstances around that. For example, there have been a few sites that have been contaminated and then required decontamination. That's definitely an additional expense not contemplated originally on the job. That would be something that could fall into that bucket as an example.
And then what about lost revenue, lost profit, things like that?
Lost revenue and lost profit is the side of the business income and extra expense that is more difficult in the construction world. You know, if you're a restaurant and you can look at your sales year over year by month, that's a much easier task of being able to say, I lost my revenues for the month of April, for example. In construction, where you're dealing with long-term and typically finite contracts that are ongoing, some have been awarded already, some are waiting to start. You know, it's just because you're not working today doesn't mean that that job's not going to start again tomorrow. And so to the extent that you've lost revenue, it's harder to prove because the revenue ultimately will be realized in most cases.
All right, and so Bill, I'm going to put you on the spot with an unrehearsed question for you. As we see, a lot of the people who are watching this webinar right now are condominium associations and property managers. And so for property insurance or business interruption type claims, a lot of these associations have ongoing construction, they have concrete remediation projects, it goes on and on and on. And they're impacted in all the ways that Doug and Janice have told us about. What would you recommend on, you know, just in general, that they be thinking about in terms of trying to recoup as much insurance proceeds for their losses as possible under standard property insurance or similar type claims?
Right. Well, I'm going to go back to my disclaimers and say that every policy reads differently. The intent of most property policies is going to be to exclude events like COVID-19. Whether or not ultimately there may be coverage there depends on the actual wording of each policy and case law that's probably forthcoming at some point down the road. And I think for any industry, the answer is very similar to what we just discussed with Doug and Janice. It's about tracking your expenses and making very clear notes as to why those expenses were incurred and attaching that to the event that's going on now. On the business income side, you know, that's really an accounting function. And again, outside of construction, maybe a little easier for people to point to year over year revenue trends and be able to relate a loss of revenue specifically to the COVID-19 event.
All right, and then you're saying tracking expenses. Doug and Janice have both talked about now that there may be some claims that are going to come out of this for the acceleration once we're done. Those claims pass upstream, as you know. The subs go up to the contractor is going to pass them up to the owner. And so are these the kinds of expenses you're talking about that maybe an association or its property managers, assuming they can get coverage, which I'm going to talk about in a second, might be able to recover under policies?
Yeah, yes, those are the types of expenses, but you know, keeping in mind that I don't want to say they could recover them under their policies because right now their policies probably exclude the coverage.
All right, so let's talk about that exclusion. And so you said a couple times now that a lot of these policies do exclude pandemics and the type of thing that we're dealing with COVID-19. But to harken back to what I talked about in the force majeure context, could an argument, and I'm putting you on the spot because, like I said at the beginning, there is no law on this yet. But from your experience working with coverage issues with these policies, could the associations and their property managers make a cogent argument that this is not a COVID-19 covered thing, but rather a governmental action interference covered thing when they signed executive orders that impacted construction?
I think they could make a cogent argument, and with good attorneys like you, I'm sure that will be done across the United States. The question is whether the argument, as valid as it might be, is going to be successful in getting the carrier to determine in their favor for coverage, because ultimately all these actions go back to COVID-19.
And there's plenty of litigation that's been filed now in the federal courts. I know of a handful of cases already that are addressing these issues. So you're right, it will get resolved. Let's assume for this next question that the courts come down and say, no, it was governmental action, which may or may not be true, but let's say. And with your caveat that every policy is written differently, they do follow form and generalities. Based on your experience, is that an easier thing to get coverage under if, in fact, it is a governmental action, meaning you don't have the exclusion that you have a pandemic? Are typical policies written in a way that would preclude coverage for governmental action, or do you think it'd be easier to recover?
So there's talk about the framework. I don't want to get too deep into the policy framework, but there's definitions of what constitutes an occurrence. There are coverage triggers, and then there are exclusions that are in by endorsement, et cetera. Assuming that the definition of occurrence would include government action, then you've gotten past that. Now you're talking about what the coverage trigger is. And this is where a lot of the litigation that I'm seeing is starting to come up. The coverage triggers usually require property damage or physical damage, however the policy wants to read. And the question is whether that has occurred. Now you've got some cases, for example, a meatpacking plant who had an ammonia spill, and that was considered physical damage, although none of the facility was actually damaged. They just had to do a cleanup. In that case, which was litigated, it was in favor of the meatpacking plant, and so the coverage was there. That's one of the cases that a lot of folks that are filing litigation right now are kind of looking at, because it seems to work in favor with COVID-19, whether the potential infection of a job site or a workplace in general constitutes physical damage. So you got to get past the definition of occurrence and then whether a coverage trigger actually exists or not. And if you can get past those two things, now you're going to your endorsements, looking at your exclusions and seeing precisely how they might apply to your situation.
So once again, though, the takeaway here probably with all these unresolved issues is make the claim, push the claim, don't take no for an answer. If your insurance adjuster says there's no coverage, make it anyway and see what happens, right?
I would encourage anyone that feels like they have a good claim to make it.
Okay. All right. So Janice, let's go back over to you, and going back to the construction site now. A lot of what's going on with construction starts with people like you, the suppliers that are going to be supplying the materials that those on the job are going to install to build the building. And so we have an issue now with COVID with supply chain management. A lot of the supplies on most of these projects come from China and other foreign countries, and the supply lines are getting all tied up. Why don't you tell us what you're seeing and what some of your strategies are, or recommendations are to try to grease those wheels and get around it?
Okay, yes. So right now the supply chain management, we are seeing that supplies that we used to be able to get with short lead times, we now are getting longer lead times. Some of them can be anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks. So right now it's strongly recommended to secure project materials, especially when they are from overseas, but also locally. We are also seeing that smaller businesses that are having a direct impact by this pandemic they are changing their business models, where they used to extend terms, and now without any notice, they are changing their terms to be cash on delivery. So that has been a new challenge for us. And what we have been doing is looking at our cash resources and finding ways that we take a cash on delivery from a small business and process it through a credit card so that we can extend our terms so that it doesn't put strain on our cash flows. And then by doing that, we're also going to be receiving back rewards that we can later use to pay down towards future expenses of the business. So definitely right now with the supply chain, I would say you don't want to be planning short term for your projects. You want to be thinking 6 months and out. If possible, looking at the entire scope of the project and making sure that you have all the supplies that you need. We actually took measures to increase our min-max levels for common supplies that we use, like installation supplies, factory supplies, and just making sure that projects don't get delayed because we aren't able to get something as simple as screws and nails or glue that we need for our baseboard installations. That is a top priority for us.
And Doug, from your perspective, are you seeing some of those issues that Janice described starting to flow up to you? And if so, how are you handling it?
Well, we've been blessed so far that we haven't run into too many issues. We don't import a lot of product from China or overseas for that matter. So I know there is some that is manufactured, but it's usually the distributor. Where we're seeing the delays is on the longer lead time equipment, whether it be our switchgear, generators, backup power systems. We're heavy into building in the healthcare arena. We just did the temporary hospital inside the Miami Beach Convention Center, and we put in a massive amount of electrical in there and low voltage in 10 days to build that hospital facility. It's a 450 bed facility. 50 of them were negative air containment areas strictly meant for COVID patients. But the amount of material, we did run into some logistical issues with the amount of material in the short time we needed it. But I want to say our suppliers really stepped up and did what was necessary to pull together to bring that project in a very short period of time. But going back to something I said earlier, that we are putting in specific contract language. We do have a rather large project coming up again in the healthcare arena. And one of the things that we're running into with this one is longer lead times because manufacturers are expecting delays on equipment, particularly the generators and the switchgear again.
All right, we have about 12 minutes left. I've received 2 questions so far, so let me throw those questions out to you guys, and then if there are any other questions, type them now, and we'll answer them. And if not, after we answer these 2 questions, we'll find some other wrap-up topics to fill the rest of the time. And so the first one, Janice, goes to you, and that is, you mentioned earlier in the presentation about what you're seeing on the site in response to COVID-19. And you mentioned about, I think it was you, about taking the temperature of the workers going to the site. It was either you or Doug. The question specifically is whether anyone has implemented a process for taking the temperature of workers going onto the job sites. And we know that they are. Can you describe what you're experiencing and how that's being implemented?
What we're seeing is having the handheld temperature reader so that when workers are present at the job site, that their temperature to make sure that they're healthy. That was something that we saw happen at the GC level, but it's a safety protocol right now that is our new norm at this time.
How's that impacting the staffing? Is it taking, I assume, longer for people to get onto the site and get started? Is that impacting job progress at all?
It doesn't really, because the temperature reader is immediate. So it doesn't really slow it down that much. It might take an extra 30 seconds to a minute to just make sure that all the employees are in good health.
Okay. Doug, the other question that came in, I'm going to throw to you, and that is, what is your view or your thought about what may happen to construction costs coming out of this pandemic as contractors try to recover from all of the ills that we've talked about now over the last 50 minutes?
Well, that's kind of a loaded question. We've seen oil prices drop incredibly, which is going to affect certain construction materials, like the manufacture of PVC and transportation costs going to be cheaper. We think there's going to be some pent-up demand. We think there could create temporary shortages because everybody's trying to get the same amount of material all at the same time, because some firms have been sitting on the sidelines. I know the home building industry has been more deeply affected than us, for instance, because we're commercial. We deal primarily in the commercial arena. And again, we do a lot of healthcare and a lot of institutional. We've had some projects placed on hold, but for the most part, we've kept the people that want to work in our company have jobs, and we've kept them busy. But we do expect some short-run material shortages when the whole world gets cranked back up again, because building is going to resume, and once it does, everybody's going to be trying to get a hold of the same, number 10 wire or number 12 wire or whatever, and it's going to, especially in commodity items, I think it could, the supply houses too, because some of the trucking hasn't been as free as, or not free, but freely distributed as it was previously. We've seen some temporary shortages in some of the supply houses, but I think for the most part, when things crank back up, it's going to be a free-for-all.
Now, we've seen that dynamic even just when there's just been a number of hurricanes that have hit the U.S. and then the demand for copper or the demand for concrete or lumber went up just in those affected regions, and that causes shortages and delays and increase in prices just then. And so now, as you're talking about, the whole world's going to go through that. So it's a good point.
And the other side of that is obviously we're not only materials, but we're labor too. And I think from a labor standpoint, we might see, because people want to get back to work quickly, or they may even cross boundaries and go to career changes, you may see more availability of labor, at least on a temporary basis, when things start to crank back up.
But not necessarily skilled labor.
No, not necessarily skilled labor. I would agree with that. There was already a shortage of skilled labor before we entered into this thing. You might see, because of the way some companies handled this thing, you might see some people switching teams though, and so it may create opportunities for firms that have a solid backlog of work and can put some of the skilled trades to work right away.
Janice, you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I agree with Doug's statement.
Okay. We just got another question here, so I'm reading it without having screened it, so everybody brace yourself. It says, we see stoppage of projects being handled differently by different municipalities. Can an association withhold payment for work done by a contractor prior to stoppage of project? And so I suppose that's a legal question for me to answer. And the answer is really all going to turn to what your construction contract says. Everything on the job, when you're dealing with claims, stoppage of work, what your rights and remedies are going to be, you've got to look at your contract. It's the Bible. There's not going to be any law that just in and of itself will apply to every situation. But if you have a contractor, if I read this question right, can an association withhold payment for work done by a contractor prior to the stoppage of the work? I'm assuming what's being asked about is the contractor's legitimate work, everything's going fine, now the work is stopping, and can we avoid paying what we probably should have been paying all along only because the project has stopped? And so you've got to look at, like I said, your contract to see if there's a force majeure provision, to see if there's a termination for convenience provision that might impact how much you have to pay and how much not. But I can tell you that all things being equal, most of the construction contracts that I have seen will probably require you to pay for the work that was legitimately done before the stoppage. And any relief you get from payment will probably be things that happened after the stoppage. The next question, where they're starting to come in now, I've got a couple that have come in. The next one says, what do you suggest we do for protecting our workers and owners when entering a home to do work? Which is a really good question. I'm dealing with that right now. So Janice, that's kind of along the lines of what you were talking about with the health and safety measures. So we've got a contractor who's going to go into a home to do work. How do you protect both the construction employees and the owners in the home?
Yeah, so I think, the best thing to do is always come prepared with your own protective. So have a face mask, have gloves, have supplies like hand sanitizer, practice good hygiene while at the site, while you leave the site. Those are just some pretty basic and best practice things to follow. Have a thermometer and make sure you take temperatures, and maybe even ask the owner of the residence if they don't mind. That gives your employee assurance that they also are in good health. That might be a little bit on a legal side. I don't know what the repercussions could be for asking that, but it could be just a voluntary question, just to give less fear and feel comfortable in the work environment itself.
One thing I can tell you about is we represent a lot of condominium associations, and I'm sure everyone on this webinar knows about Chapter 558, which is the mandatory pre-suit inspection and opportunity to cure, opportunity to settle procedures that owners have to follow before suing for construction defects. And so we do this all the time. We do it in our sleep, but for the first time now, I have an association that we're scheduling our site inspection. There's probably going to be 60 to 80 minimum people, maybe even 100 who are going to come do the site inspection. And we always have releases that the association requires people to sign before they come on and make sure they have workers' comp coverage. But now for the first time, we're also invoking a safety protocol. And so we had to kind of write that from scratch based on just what we see in CDC guidelines. And it's along the lines of everyone who's in there has got to wear gloves, you got to wear a mask, got to wear booties. We may take their temperature. If we're seeing coughs or sneezes, we may exclude them. It's pretty much the common sense type things. But what we're doing is we're passing that protocol out in writing before anybody shows up, so they know what they're getting into, because we will exclude them if they don't. And so that could apply here. If you guys, like Janice said, it's almost voluntary. I mean, at this point, we're all kind of flying by the seat of our pants. And if you just get on the same page and have a written protocol that everyone will stick to, I think most people will do it because they understand the need. We have, yep, go
I'd
ahead.
like to weigh in real quick on that
Yeah.
too. First of all, we put the responsibility in the hands for our service people that are going to multiple locations potentially in one day. We always put personal responsibility on them. We're supplying, like Janice, the masks, the gloves, the hard hats, the eye protection. We have additional protocols we've implemented, but we're finding that many of the facilities that we're going to either have their own set of rules, which we have to go through their protocols when we're entering in, but we leave the call finally to our technicians that are out there in the field, that if they feel they're going into a situation that's unsafe, we let them make the call. And then we circle back with the customer and say, look, we ran into these things. We don't feel comfortable entering your facility.
And I would hope most contractors would share that attitude. It'll make things go a lot smoother. We have one last question, and we're also out of time, but that question is, we're going to have to defer. And so it says, how can associations enforce private contractors hired by the owner to follow safety protocols? And so actually another question just came up. They're all flying in now. We have a lot of questions. I'll look at them in a minute, and maybe we'll extend this 5 or 10 minutes. But for that question, how can associations enforce private contractors that are retained by unit owners to follow safety protocols? That's not a construction issue. That's a condominium association rights issue between the association and its unit owners. One of the beauties about being in Becker and Polikoff, that is a diversified and condo-centric firm, is we have other lawyers in our firm that can answer that. So what I would ask the person who posed that question is, if you just shoot me an email afterwards restating that question, I will get one of our condominium association attorneys to give you the answer that you need to that. The question after that now says, I'm running into an essential business, cleaning, being turned away from the condominium and not allowed in. Can the board override this decision? Same thing. If you send me that email, that's an association rights and responsibilities question. Another person asked me for a copy of the safety protocol I'm using on the 558 inspection. Again, if you'll just email me, I'm happy to send it to you. And it looks like that's all the questions. I think we just hit them all. So those last few, just send me the emails and we'll get you what you need. We're at 12 o'clock. We'll go just maybe 5 minutes over. Doug, Janice, Bill, I want to give each of you one shot. If there's any wrap-up comments or takeaways you'd like for the attendees. Doug, why don't we start with you?
Well, I feel like I've said enough already. I just want to encourage everybody to remain safe and healthy, continue to practice the social protocols that have been put in place, like the social distancing or whatnot. I see more and more people. I've noticed traffic patterns. We were an essential business from the get-go. First week, it was pretty sparse out there. There was nobody on the road. I could commute easily to work, and I've seen the traffic beginning to pick up more and more each day. And we've noticed where we were going to some job sites that I think people are getting a little comfortable out there. So just encourage everybody to be safe and continue to exercise the protocols until we've been given the all clear sign.
Sage advice. Janice?
So my last thoughts to everybody is the same as Doug: be safe, stay healthy. I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I think that right now we're seeing good things come out of this. Having the increased safety protocols is actually a benefit back to our industry. We're making smarter decisions and we're putting our workers' health first. Additionally, we're going to walk away with this with new technology and new communication strategies. It's all around. We have to look at the positive side of COVID and how it's going to make us better and smarter as business owners.
Okay, Bill?
I think I'd like to just address real quickly on the surety side. We're not seeing it here because largely work continues, but in other areas of the country where construction either isn't considered essential or is otherwise kind of at a stop, there are a lot of contractors that are hurting as a result of that. And so the surety marketplace is looking at things like cash flow stress testing, for example, is a big one. They want to know your sustainability and your current cash flow, what kind of bank lines of credit you have. Their advice and the conferences I've been part of is that if you have a credit line, to draw it, which seems counterintuitive from a surety underwriting standpoint, but they would rather you have the cash in your account, even if it's just sitting there earning 0.0007% interest. But they'd rather have that cash available to you immediately rather than sitting on hold and potentially not being available down the road. And from an SDI standpoint, subcontractor default insurance, just like all your relationships that you have, it's important that you stay in close communication with your subcontractors who are enrolled. Make sure that they aren't faced with some type of impending situation that could impact their ability to finish your job. And in all these conversations, I think the key is communicating. It's easy to work from an unusual spot and kind of become non-communicative, but this is a time when more than ever we need to be communicating with each other from a business perspective to make sure that we all know where everyone is. So with that said, I echo what Doug and Janice said. Everybody be safe, continue doing the right things, and hopefully this will all be over soon.
All right, and so we're going to put up right now our contact page if our department can put that up. And this is going to be the best way to contact us. We've got some questions about what email addresses are. And so you'll see mine here. And any of our panelists, I can tell you from experience, are very unselfish with their time. They're happy to answer questions. We all do quite a bit of speaking. We reach out to each other to pick each other's brains on content. And I can say the other three have been completely unselfish over and over and over. If you have questions, feel free to call any of them. I know that they'll take your call, send them emails, and they'll be happy to help out. And so with that, I want to thank everybody for attending. I also echo everyone's comments about staying safe and prudent, and good luck to you. Thank you.